In just about any kind of study of certain phenomenon, there's a process of modeling where you put some things together and see how they function that way. And interpersonal communication is no different. We're going to look at, as we kind of sum up the first third here of the class, humanistic and pragmatic models, okay, models of interpersonal effectiveness. The humanistic side really is kind of some might call it the soft side to this idea of interpersonal communication. And the pragmatic side, by contrast, then they would call the hard side. I don't know if I would go that far. In fact, there's a lot of overlap between these here. And as we go through these, I'm going to ask you at the end, what's your makeup, your interpersonal makeup? How much of you is humanistic? How much of your communication is pragmatic? And obviously, you're going to find, or have found, hopefully through the put into practice activities, that this changes depending on the relationship that you get into. So let's start off with the humanistic model. Okay, there are 5 attributes to this. There's openness, empathy, supportiveness, positiveness, and this idea of equality. So I'm going to take these one at a time. I'm hoping that you're used to that style by now in terms of what we do. So let's go with openness, all right? This quality has a number of aspects to that, the first of which is this idea that we're willing to disclose, okay? And with that comes really a willingness to be vulnerable within that disclosure. Anytime you go through and you take whatever that is down in your hidden pain, you pop that up into your open pain, you're going through and being open, right? So this openness is tempered. We're not disclosing everything to everybody all the time. We know people like that, and they're not a whole lot of fun to be around. So we have the ability to go through and understand what's appropriate, when that is appropriate, in order to go through and facilitate perhaps what's happening. We're being humanistic here really in an attempt to bridge something more on the relational side of things, whereas the pragmatic model is trying to bridge communication, shared meaning on the content side of things here. So that willingness to be open, that willingness to disclose goes through and helps firm up things more relationally. Secondly, we want to react honestly. No more editing how we might feel. And again, we need to balance that with being appropriate. But everybody deserves an honest response, an honest reaction, instead of going through and thinking, well, if I say this, I might hurt your feelings. Well, if we decided not to take anything personally, and if our companion has decided not to take anything personally, we don't really have to consider that anymore. Not that that gives us license to be rude, but we come into charge of how we feel and how we're going to react, and that person comes into that same responsibility in terms of reacting honestly. And it should say at this point that if you're not, if you're in a relationship with a significant other and you haven't shared what you've been learning over the course of this, that other person's at a disadvantage. So not a bad idea maybe to have them go through and join you as far as these videos are concerned that way. Not only are we reacting honestly, but we're doing that directly, meaning within that temporal context that if, again, the occasion allows, we have the ability to do it promptly, to make that, to have that response. There are times, if we are escalated, that we might want to go through and delay that directness. But for the most part, if we're just talking open, honestly, we've put that disclosure out there, and there's nothing wrong with being direct and being direct with our emotions as well. Lastly, and I think this is pretty critical, is in being open, we need to own where we're coming from, take responsibility for that. And that's becoming increasingly difficult these days, especially with certain mediated influences out there like social media, traditional media, everything that's going on. We seem to be swayed or hopping on the bandwagon because certain attitudes might agree with ours on our social media feed, on our Facebook feed, when in fact, maybe they don't. And the only reason why we've been agreeing with them is because they're popular. Okay, you've heard that term if you've listened to anything happening in current events. You've heard about the popular candidate, that they're dealing with the popular or the populist responses. Those populists, those individuals who respond to that, don't own their standpoint. They haven't taken the critical consideration to go through and say, oh, where do I stand on this? How do I really feel about this particular issue? So the more ownership you have of that, the better your ability to be open, and not necessarily to be open in terms of constantly putting it out there, but to be open in terms of willing to share that standpoint if it's called upon. Okay, so openness is the first quality. Let's get into quality number 2, which is empathy. We talked about this in listening, and there's a lot to be said here in terms of empathy. And a lot of folks kind of confuse this with sympathy. They're not the same thing. Empathy is that ability to try to understand where the other person's coming from. It's not the ability to understand where the person's coming from. It's the attempt to do that. We can't reach perfect empathy. We can go through and assess the feelings, and if we are vulnerable enough to go there, we can maybe find similar experiences that we had and then share that. And an example here, I've shared with you that my oldest son passed away before his 9th birthday. He was 8 years and 10 months old, and he passed away as a response to a lifelong fight that he had, a condition of aspiration pneumonia. Okay. Shortly after my first marriage ended, I met a woman who I ended up marrying, marriage number 2. And in our disclosures to each other, when we first met, actually, she had disclosed to me that she had lost her daughter around the same age as my son. But her loss happened almost, the daughter complained of a headache, went to take a nap, and then she died. She had a brain bleed, and nobody knew that was going on. So here we both lost a child. And when you're grieving, there's a tendency to look for that empathy with somebody else to understand, because I wouldn't wish this on anybody. It's an entirely different world. We made the mistake, though, of thinking that perhaps we feel the same way in losing a child, but the way we lost that child was totally different. My son, while nothing could prepare me for his passing, I still knew it was coming. With her child, had no idea. And so I can't imagine what it would be like to lose a whole child. It's beyond my comprehension. And so it'd be a mistake to go through and say, well, I'm empathic with her, okay? Outside of just simply the loss of losing a child. All right, well, enough of that. Empathy cannot exist simultaneously with evaluation. We can't judge somebody and empathize with them at the same time. It's impossible. Okay, it preempts it. So we need to make sure that our own psychological noise is managed enough to where we are not going through and adding any kind of value, and that's both negative and positive. Okay, you might really like this person. We might be really attracted to their ideas and what's going on. But in order for us to be empathic, if we have that kind of bias that's going on, we can't reach empathy with them, because we are hoping that they feel the same way as we do. And if we do that, we've kind of obscured the situation. The empath soaks up the context of what's going on. They're aware, at least on 3, if not 4 different contextual levels, physically, obviously, but psychologically, socially, and culturally, they've been able to identify perhaps what is in common there with them. They soak up that context. And they identify their own emotions and how they might be different from the emotions of the person, or might be the same of the emotions of the person that they're talking to. So how did you feel when that happened to you? Oh, I might have felt a little bit differently. I would have felt the same way. I would have felt angry or whatever. But these kinds of expressions go through, identify those emotions, so then we can find that connection, that combination. Only if you want to take that risk of going there. This isn't easy. And for us to truly empathize with somebody is to go through and say, I am willing to go and feel the same pain that you're feeling. If we want to go into that deep water and tread with them, we become subject to peril just like they are. And so there's a risk in that. And that risk might be indicative of how much you love that person, certainly. Um, I'll just leave it at that. In order for us to be empathic, we need to allow ourselves to be seen. They need to allow themselves to be seen. Again, if you haven't seen the video on vulnerability with Brene Brown, it's in the modules for this class. Go through and take a look at that so you have a better understanding of what this means. All right. So empathy is the second humanistic quality in the humanistic model. Let's move on to this concept of supportiveness. This is interesting, and this becomes a little on the practical side. To be supportive means, again, that we cannot be evaluative. And so I have two terms up here, descriptive versus being evaluative. And if you're a parent or want to become a parent, this is something pretty handy to understand. To describe somebody's performance, to describe their attitude, is not to go through and evaluate it. Let me give you an example. I use my son Christopher a lot over the course of this content. I can't remember which grade, I think it's fourth or fifth grade. He had a math test going on. And this kid he busted his butt to go through and study, and he did really well on the math test. Comes back, he's got a big red A on it. And the teacher wrote in red, "Chris, you're a math genius." Okay? Now that's an evaluative response, because genius is a very positive thing, right? We like that. That's an evaluation. So the next math test that came along, guess what Chris did? Nothing. Because he's a math genius, and he got it from the authority on that, his math teacher, right? And so he gets the test back. It's got like a C- on it, and in red writing says, "Chris, what happened?" ? That's the problem with evaluation, either negatively or positively, is as soon as we set that up, and if that person hooks into that, and again, here's the beauty of that agreement of not taking anything personally, because you don't hook into it at that point. But when you hook into that evaluation, there's an expectation that's going to follow through, and somebody's going to be disappointed along the way. Being descriptive is different, and this sounds like it's kind of a cold-hearted parenting kind of thing to do. I try to do this as a teacher, and I've tried to do this as a father. So if I were the teacher, instead of, "Chris, you're a math genius," I would have said, "Chris, you got every single one of them right." Now, right might be an evaluative term, but what this is totally descriptive, because that's exactly what happened on the test. Okay? Being descriptive then skirts any kind of hook. And we're able to go through and communicate more directly in terms of what that problem might be. Now, that doesn't mean that I've never called my daughter beautiful. She's extraordinarily beautiful. That might not mean that I haven't praised students for doing excellent on a test or whatever. But at the same time, in order for me to be truly supportive, I need to go through and find that balance and make sure that I am descriptive in my support, so they know perhaps what needs to happen differently or what needs to happen next. Also, we need to be open-minded. That's what provisional means. That in order for us to be supportive, we don't have to accept maybe their position. We might be disagreeing on something like abortion, and we might go through and say, "Well, I feel differently than you, but I am open to your ideas about it. I might not accept those ideas, and that's okay, but I'm open at least to going through and exploring that, and maybe even allowing you to express that." And we'll get to expressiveness here in just a minute. Before that, though, let's get into positiveness. And this is a little weird for me. I'm not a big fan of this whole concept of attitudinal positiveness, basically because for a lot of people it's forced. And I'm not one to force anything, because I want to make sure that my expressions at least are genuine and that we're not going through and patronizing. So if I'm feeling crappy for the day, I might maybe even avoid contact or diminish contact. And if it's like with my spouse, I might go through and say, having a rough day. I don't feel very well. So if I'm not that communicative, she won't take me personally anyway, but I'll put that out there. Okay. However, I also think like happiness, a good attitude is a choice. And if we can make a choice to maybe to get beyond what it is that we might be feeling physiologically, we can go through and improve things. It's a balance, and it's entirely up to you. Here in the communication, interpersonal communication book, this is what they put out with this concept is attitudinal positiveness, and I'm throwing in here to be genuine instead of being patronizing. To be patronizing means you have some kind of an agenda with your positiveness. You want this person to do something. You're trying to persuade them to go along with the way you're thinking, or to have lunch with you, or whatever the case might be. And we don't want to do that because it lacks authenticity. Next and last here, the fifth element. Gosh, have I gone through everything? Yeah, I guess I have. Is equality. And this, boy, this is a term that's been thrown around so much that we don't understand it as well. And not that that's a bad thing. The civil rights movement certainly went through and tried to go through and create some level playing field. It hasn't yet, in my opinion. We have a long ways to go. What I'm talking about here in terms of equality is how we see that significant other, whoever the other person in this dyad. And while we might have our differences in terms of gender, we might have our differences in terms of sex, and those are two different things. We could talk about that later on. We can recognize that we have an equal stake within the relationship. We can recognize that we both bring equal value to what it is that we're trying to accomplish, especially as parents or as just a couple trying to go through the day-to-day of managing lives and enjoying things and going on vacation and traveling and writing and creating and building and doing those kinds of things, that we recognize that there is an equality within us. What tears down that equality really happens just within our own simple communication. And there are two words there that have a tendency to go through and erode at that foundation of equality. The first word is this one. It's when you go through and say, well, maybe you should go through and take a look at. As soon as we use that word, we've taken ourselves from the horizontal plane of that relationship and we've turned ourselves vertically, meaning we're above the other person. Now, well, maybe I should do this because it says, first off, that you know better. And you know what? In some cases, you do know better. As a parent, you might know better. And maybe, we need to use that word from time to time, but we might be able to go around and say, so I've had experience in doing the same thing, and this is what I was able to come up with. As opposed to, well, maybe you should look at it this way. Okay? Because it becomes condescending. It takes us from that horizontal position within our relationship and it turns us vertically. The other word is this one. Ought. It has the same effect as should. Should and ought statements go through and change the power structure within a relationship. And it'd be stupid for me to say that there aren't or shouldn't be a power structure to relationships. They exist just due to our human nature. But the more we can go through and manage what that means, okay, the better off we are. And by eliminating should and ought statements, we have a better ability to go through and reach this concept of equality. We'll talk about power later on, the last thing in the semester, actually, when we get into the relational stages. Okay, so that's the humanistic model: openness, empathy, supportiveness, positiveness, and equality. Let's take a look at the pragmatic model. 5. Imagine that ideas here as well that we'll get into: confidence, immediacy, interaction management, expressiveness, and other orientation. Let's start with confidence. Now remember, the pragmatic side is that content-oriented side, okay, not the relational side like the humanistic model was. So here we're trying to go through and we have a bit of an agenda. We want to exact some kind of change. We want to affect some kind of persuasive something that's going on here. If you're in sales, these 5 qualities are going to help you out. Okay, if you want to go through and arbitrate, bingo, you've got some great qualities here. If you want to go through and problem solve with your significant other, this is where these ideas come in. And the first one is this concept of confidence. And this has to do with our own reflection of who we are and how we put that out there. We talked about assertiveness here within our interpersonal exchanges, and confidence really is the result of that idea of assertiveness. The confident individual takes initiative. They open conversations. They're the first ones to reach out in terms of that tactile contact, like a handshake there, or a hand on a shoulder, or something that way. And they have that ability to immediately open communication, making eye contact and taking that initiative to go through and see that everybody is involved there. They have the ability to control their emotions. On the humanistic side, we're saying, well, we need to identify emotions, especially empathically, in terms of what's going on. On the pragmatic side, emotions are important, but we need to control them because they might go through and undermine our credibility within our own confidence. If that makes any sense. And then we need to be authentic. What we say can be trusted. To be impeccable with our word is that authenticity, and that's what goes through and helps establish our confidence in what's going on. I'm losing my voice here. Immediacy is next. And this is an interesting concept within the model. Not only within our confidence, we're going through and being assertive, putting out those types of messages, but our proximity within that exchange becomes important too. Both physical proximity, remember we talked about proxemics and nonverbal communication. Well, the proper distance here, and usually it's a social distance in terms of proximity, is going to go through and help out our immediacy. Okay, not just the temporal idea of how quickly we respond, but our immediacy in terms of the intimacy of the exchange we have happening. And we need to be sensitive to what that proximity is. If the person backs off, then we've gotten too close. All right, we've maybe exacerbated that idea of proximity or spatial relationships in that immediacy. So proximity is important spatially, and it's important temporally too within that context, that we have the ability to respond. We've all gotten involved in some kind of exchange where later on we go, oh, you know what, I should have said this. And more often than not, it's our own anxiety that keeps us from actually coming up with that thought at the time. So proximity might also go through and say, take a little time in between your sentences. You don't have to have something. You don't have to fill the air constantly with the sound of your voice. You can go through and do some critical analysis and think about what it is you're going to be saying next, which has to do with feedback. Okay? When feedback's important here, especially within a pragmatic exchange where we go through and we tell the individual, you're doing really well in explaining to me how you feel, or explaining to me how this works, or just to go through and give them that kind of feedback opens up a more free-flowing channel in terms of how we're going through and communicating. And that leads me to this concept of interaction management. And this happens on ourselves, really. We can manage ourselves in interaction management. The first thing we need to take a look at is what we're saying verbally and what we're saying non-verbally the same thing. Is there a continuity happening between all those messages that are coming from us non-verbally and the words that are coming out of our mouths? We know people who don't have that agreement, and they don't have credibility. It might be because they're lying, because their body's saying one thing and their mouths are saying another, and there's no concert, there's no continuity between those two ideas. So make sure that we have this agreement between verbal and nonverbal ideas. The pragmatic person is what's called turn cue savvy. Okay, they understand that while somebody is talking, until they make eye contact back and stop their verbal disclosure, which is a turn cue, that we're not going to go through and interrupt them. Or they might stop and look and raise eyebrows to open up, well, do you have anything else to say? And these are all turn cues, okay, in terms of how that conversation is flowing. So they understand that in terms of their interaction management. And to go back to all of these, they're self-monitored. In communication, in interpersonal communication studies, we have high self-monitors, we have low self-monitors. And we're finding that depending on the communication context that they're in, the high self monitor has the ability to go through and do more self-control and is more pragmatic. They know if they're smiling, they know the tonality of their voice and the speed and tempo at which they're speaking in terms of their paralinguistics. They know what their body language is doing. This is a high self-monitor, right? In order to go through and reach the objectives that they have communicatively. The low self-monitor is not as concerned about all these things. And typically this goes from the content, high self-monitor, to the relational, low self-monitor. I'm a low self-monitor with my spouse and with my kids. I'm a high self-monitor with you, with students, or with other faculty or my colleagues. I'm a low self-monitor with my friends. I'm a high self-monitor with people that I have contracts with in terms of teaching and training. So these three ideas all become a part of that interaction management. Next is this concept of expressiveness. I alluded to this a little bit when we were talking about openness, that there needs to be some authenticity to that. It also needs to be timely. We have that temporal consideration again to make sure that we are responding in a way that deals with the issue directly at hand. I'm trying to go through and put this in different words, but it's not coming out. We also need to know that we are appropriate in that expressiveness in terms of our own emotions here. And expressiveness happens when we are actively listening. The active listener has the ability to ask for clarification, to go through and respond empathically, to go through and make that eye contact. So they're active on both verbal and nonverbal levels. And that becomes an expression in terms of how they're attending to what is being said. Lastly is this concept of other orientation. And this gets into one of my favorite words, consideration. What does it mean to be considerate? And then what does it mean to consider something? It's a kind of a double-edged verb in that respect. Consideration is a combination of two. To be considerate is to be kind, right? To be considerate of others is to be kind, is to be aware, is to be critical of maybe what their needs are. Not critical in terms of evaluation, but critical in terms of what might be needed, okay? To consider something is to be critically thoughtful here. So put these together, and consideration is to be critically kind. So if we're dealing with another individual, we're going through and we're considering who they are, where they're coming from, their beliefs, their values, their attitudes. And then we're also being kind, always being kind, in our exchange with them in that other orientation. We're being confirmative. This might be a new term here in terms of the semester. We're going to get into a barrier to communication called disconfirmation, where we summarily ignore the presence of somebody else. Confirmation is going through and not ignoring them. It's seeing them. It's confirming them. I see you, and I know we're communicating. And I'm not going to go through and use my nonverbal language to go through and turn you out of the conversation. Being confirmative is very other-oriented in terms of I know you're there, I value your input, I value you listening to me, and I'm hoping that you are going to go through and do the same. And that's where agreement comes in. Not just agreement in terms of we're allowing ourselves to go through and talk and listen to each other. It could also be finding agreement. We might be coming from different viewpoints on a topic, but we overlap somewhere. Okay, I promise you, we all do. Those, I used abortion, I think, a little earlier in this. Despite the abortion argument, okay, the main overlap here is a value of human life. And so if we can come to some level of agreement on that, perhaps we can go through and continue the conversation. This, along with interaction management, we talked about that a little bit here, but in other orientation, we also allow their expression. And this is hard to do if we're thinking about what it is that we're going to say next, which leads to an interruption. If we interrupt somebody in that process, it goes through and does two things. It says, A, I wasn't listening to you, because B, I was trying to come up with something else to say, and now I'm going to step on you and say that because I believe what I'm saying is more important than what you're saying is. And That's the antithesis here of other orientation. And that goes for both the humanistic side and the pragmatic side. We're going to talk about the listening model. We talk about interruption within that and how it's caustic to any exchange, particularly though here as we try to go through and make sure the other person is comfortable within our exchange. So other orientation, that's the pragmatic side. So we take these two together and these different qualities to each. There's some overlap along a number of these. The humanistic side is more relational, the pragmatic side more content-oriented, okay? And over the course of our days, we change. You might not recognize that now, but I'm asking you, what is your communicative makeup, okay? During your put into practices, for example, in being assertive, you might have had to have been more pragmatic than you were humanistic. I want you to write about that. I want an answer to this question. We'll put this up as a discussion issue and see how you do.